you could even just say bad performance today. And now this is, I think, possibly the first Secret Mage ban of the tournament.
Yeah, I find it a little bit weird because he has the Paladin, which traditionally has a good matchup against Secret Mage as an aggressive variant, but maybe he's scared of the Secret Mage against his Warlock and Priest. And again, the Controller Cube Warlock matchup versus Secret Mage has long been debated, and people seem to be on opposite ends of which class they actually think is favored, and the opinions are split down the line within this tournament, and even among the casters.
Well, it's interesting too because I mean he did the ban blind, so it's not like he knows that his opponent banned Hunter and he had Paladin. I think he assumed his Paladin was going to get banned. But even then, Spell Hunter has one good matchup in this head-to-head, and that's against Secret Mage.
Yeah.
At least on paper. So you should have it covered twice over. So that's kind of where, you know, I'm kind of wondering if maybe that's just like a personal preference, or maybe he teched his lineup in a way that makes him more vulnerable to Secret Mage. Who knows?
Yeah, possibly. And the Barnes Gamer rumors hold true. So it's going to be the Big Priest first for ProfessorOak versus a Murloc Paladin from Ender. And yeah, if this Barnes gets accompanied by an Eternal Servitude, I think, well, we can see what Big Priest does best. And with Shadow Word Pain, he's able to stifle some early pressure.
Are you salty at Barnes?
Is it not obvious?
You made it. I just didn't want to, put words in your mouth, but it just sounds like you're really upset
Yeah,
by the
I'm
fact
one of
that
those
he
people.
built a deck around Barnes and then he drew it.
Nah, I mean, you can't blame somebody for bringing a deck that just works really well, but the card as a mechanic is not my favorite, let's just say.
Well, it's definitely a flashy one, and I think that, Barnes doesn't guarantee success against a Murloc Paladin that can curve out with War Leader and Gem. But alas, we'll see what's behind the cards as we go to game number 1, Murloc Paladin versus the Big Priest. So, Ender here has the 3 Murlocs in Divine Favor, so that can be a pretty good start if he's able to get onto the board. And then Divine Favor often is really good against Big Priest because they're not playing anything for several turns.
Yeah, and crucially, he can land the Chum buff onto the War Leader, which would put it out of Shadow Word Pain range. Although I assume ProfessorOak would be pretty happy already just landing this Pain on the Tidecaller, because that's one of the ways to get some really large amounts of early damage in, especially when it's coupled with Rockpool Hunter. And honestly, as the Big Priest, all you gotta do is survive until you can play Barnes and Inter-Resurrects, and yeah, I don't mind just going for the Pain straight away here. So Ender just probably gonna curve out as his hand dictates, play 2 1-drops. Although the Hydraulic just did provide an option for playing, I feel like he really wanted to get the buff onto the War Leader, so it's a bit unfortunate that it didn't land there. Still provides him with more pressure this turn though, so you can't be too sad about it.
Yeah, and I think what's just important is that he has, that building pressure to the point where ProfessorOak, even if he gets Barnes, if he's not landing on anything consequential, then he can still just pressure and it doesn't even matter.
Right, and consequential minions in this case would be something like Obsidian Statue, which immediately removes a minion aside from the one that trades into it, and of course Yashiraj, the most impactful one. And aside from that though, Lich King is already in hand, so he doesn't have the potential to get a cheated Death Indicate, which is really insane in this matchup. And he still needs to draw into some kind of revival option.
Yashiraj it is.
The best result though. Alright, so Gentle Megastore provides...
Yeah, that's really good.
Wind Fury does more than +3 attack here.
That could be lethal.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, you're right. And doesn't quite hit it. Is he actually going for the trade here? Okay. He can clear out all the Yashirajas, but it does leave up the Barnes to trade into the War Leader, and he's essentially given up all his threats there.
Pint-sized potion as well to answer the board if he desires. And, something to consider too is after Ender goes wide onto the board, you do want to consider denying the ability for Paladin to bounce back through Divine Favor. So utilizing card combos instead of being greedy sometimes is advisable. Question is now the time?
Yeah, I think I like it. The other play, I guess, is to fish for Shadow or Death with the Shadow Visions to get rid of the Megasaur and then trade in Barnes.
Yeah, does run 1 death, but I like the mana efficiency. Plus 2 Shadow Word Horrors.
Yeah, I like this better as well.
And then the second Shadow Word Horror can answer just the refill of the Call to Arms, which is what you're kind of expecting because it was very clear that Ender wanted just to finish the game.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to that turn where Ender decided to clear off the Yashirajas instead of cashing in something like, I'm going to say 14 damage, though I'm not sure, but just a hefty chunk there. What was he trying to play around?
Well, he was trying to play around the minion pull of it being a taunt. He hadn't drawn Spellbreaker by then.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't know if he can get past that minion guaranteed, even though, you know, hindsight is 2020. And obviously
and so is Caster Vision.
He would have been able to push it. Well, I mean, we didn't even know, too. He hadn't even drawn it by then. Or am I mistaken? Did he have Spellbreaker in hand?
No, not yet. So Professor Oak here finally picking up the Resurrect. Makes it a very, very clear play for him here. And now Ender, I feel like even with the Divine Favor refill for... Actually, it's just going to be 2 cards, assuming he can play the first one that he draws, along with the Divine Favor. It's just not going to be enough. Too little, too late. And that is just the power of Barnes.
Well, Ender going to sit down and at least think about what he can do in this position. It doesn't seem like very much. Blessed Maul, I guess, is cool and all.
Yeah.
The plus attack.
It's Ites. You play that and then draw 3 cards. And you have Spellbreaker for the statue, but you have no minions to push through.
So what he can do actually is play to a prince, not a prince, Sunkeeper Tarim position onto the board. If Professor Oak loads up enough and then Sunkeeper Tarim prevents Professor Oak from pushing too much and then is out of gas, because he is relatively low on cards given that Big Priest at this stage usually has like 7 to 8 cards because they can't play stuff.
Right, in that case, it makes more sense to play the Silence onto Yashiraja as Ender did.
So I think that could be, you know, the 1% to win the game at this point. But things are coming up very much in Professor Oak's camp.
Yeah, I really don't see how Ender would have the time to draw into Tarim, even if he had it, like, even if he had it next turn, he's still taking 14 to face this turn, is it? And,
Also, I mean, the redemption is really annoying.
Oh, is that redemption? Yeah, okay, so it's just 10 to face then.
And Righteous Protector is so good for 1 mana.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Eating up. Wow, he ate up 14 damage.
Yeah, just a casual 1 mana, 1/14. Alright, so we can see that the Divine Favor comes in here.
The trade is with full respect to Tarim, though, so I think Professor Oak realizes that the one way he could lose is by leaving up more minions than he's prepared to trade away post-Tarim, so I don't hate the trade, even though it looks painful.
Then how can Professor Oak throw the game, more importantly?
By misclicking the end turn button?
Well, I mean, if we're...
Yeah.
I'm trying to, you know... I'm trying to figure out the way to win, even though the game does feel over.
Still Tarim, right? And it's not a fault of Professor Oak's if Tarim is drawn, because setting up the 2-turn lethal there makes a lot of sense rather than trading into a 1/1.
Sure, but it's 2-turn lethal almost either way at that point. So you just got to question whether or not playing the Lich King there was really important. But the Tarim was limited by the mana usage. Couldn't really play too much unless he drew like 3 1-drops in Tarim. Actually, no, he only had like 8 mana, right? So you could draw 2 1-mana minions. Either way, not that consequential. Professor Oak steamrolls the Murloc Paladin with Big Priest. Very, very nice win there.
Yeah, it's not something that was a little too unexpected, having seen the Barnes in the opening hand, but again, as you mentioned, the pull off the Barnes matters a lot because it was another 2 turns before he drew the Resurrect. So if he hadn't drawn the Yashraj out of the Barnes, then things could have panned out a little bit differently. Let's say he got Ysera into a bad dream card, like Laughing Sister. could have given Ender those precious few turns to find the window to find lethal.
Yeah, that's also a big deal for Professor Oak too, because I was looking at Big Priest as being the weak point of the lineup, and now that the Big Priest is gone, now the matchup does actually slightly favor Professor Oak because of that Hunter ban. So, because the Warlock has pretty good matchups against a lot of those board-centric decks, and then, apparently aggro Recruit Paladin's the best deck in the game on ladder, at least. Statistically, I still contend whether or not it's actually the best deck. You can say it's tier 1 for sure, but is it the best deck? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, and even if it were the best deck on ladder, it's not necessarily the best deck in tournament. So a lot goes into these players' mindsets when they're trying to build these lineups, and we've seen many, many different strategies throughout the day, none probably as unique as Ghost Asas, but Ender did take kind of an out-of-the-box approach by not bringing Warlock, and he said that it's mainly because he didn't want to do Defile Math, but I'm sure the real reason behind that is that he found that these kind of curve out and be aggressive decks have a very strong place in the meta.
I think I'm just more upset at the fact that people keep banning Hunter and not giving it a chance to even be played. And I get it because it's like another Barnes moment where you might just get rolled by that, or you might get rolled by Spellstone, or things of that of that ilk. But I do think that that is also series defining. Like if Ender loses this, I think he just banned wrong, and that's almost a fundamental decision that you have to go over before the matches, either by yourself or with whoever is helping you.
Right, and you're saying banned wrong, like you think he deliberately banned it and then just said that he was mistaken?
I'm not going to judge his intent or not. He claims it's a mistake, and I'm going to believe him, but that's still just a big mistake.
Yeah, sure.
It's almost as comical as what you suggested, which is end turn accidentally. Right?
Yeah, I believe him as well. I don't think the mind games are that next level yet, but
I don't think he has anything to gain by doing it.
Yeah.
It makes more sense in a last year standing format to say that, because then you might change the way they open up their lineup with a specific deck, because the queue order matters significantly in that format, but in Conquest it's not nearly as important.
Right, and Professor Oak taking his sweet time deciding whether to play the Doomsayer here. The point that he's thinking about is that he still has Defile and Hellfire for board clears later on, so maybe he could go for not having to expend resources so much if he's going to be using AoE anyway, but he's going to be taking quite a bit of damage because of that decision.
It's a pretty severe punish, and the Murloc Tidecaller is a card that you shouldn't underestimate.
Yep.
And the reason that made me even question whether or not tapping was correct or not was he could still be tapping this turn and kind of making up for the fact that he's bridging the gap closer to his removal turns, and also he stops development for the Murlocs. But now it's it's really dangerous grounds. Now the point is he still has clear, but he's also going to take a handful of damage if Ender chooses to ignore it.
Yeah, and he can actually still just play the War Leader and clear and still give Professor Oak a lot of damage. Of course, it's not respecting Hellfire, so I like this a lot better. However, I did like playing the Doomsayer on 2, also because if you allow one Murloc to stick, and then you give them that window to play Cold Lights here on turn 3, that's the killing card that really gets them out of the Hellfire range.
Yep.
So best option here, probably just +1/+1, huh?
Yeah, anything that just helps keep the Murloc alive, because Murloc War Leader can come out.
Still not a board that Professor Oak would want to defile, so yeah, Skull makes a lot of sense. He will be taking 11 damage? No, even more this turn. 13 if he plays the War Leader as well.
There's a chance for this to go really disastrously wrong, depending on what gets pulled out here from the Cabal Lackey. Oh, sorry, the Possessed Lackey. Assuming that he wants to prioritize that, but there is, let's see, is there a possibility he just wants to clear the board instead?
Yeah, and of course, this is all Professor Oak thinking that he can't afford to play around Spellbreaker here because he just does not beat that. So even though we can see that if the Void Lord comes down, there's still an easy answer for it. Professor Oak's thinking, how can he best deal with the board, given that a Void Lord would survive?
Yeah, if he pulls out Demon Guard number 2, there's going to be 7 damage on the board no matter what, and then he's at 12 health, which means he could die to anything. Can he die to anything?
Rallying Blade.
That'd be 10. And if he had like some weird combination of the Blessed Maul plus Rallying Blade swing, you know, like 'cause he gives +1 attack. And then,
something like that.
Okay, chooses instead to do the Carnivorous Cube to clear more of the board.
Okay.
I like it.
Yeah, and you even get 1 Doom Guard living at 2 health. Seems like the best way to go about that.
Yeah, and you know what? Because he has the Defile, still has the chance of getting the possessed Lackey Snipe here. And this, you know, that is something to think about too if you're Ender.
Yeah, Ender really snapped hero powered there. I guess it's difficult to be thinking about 2-card combos like Defile and Lackey in particular, because that's the biggest punish here as compared to like Defile and some other minion. But just doesn't work out for Ender there, and I think Professor Oak has turned the corner. There is a Spellbreaker though, so the thing is, these Divine Favors are super clunky, and Ender wants Murloc / any sticky minion to actually be able to connect face here.
I mean, I'm going to give Ender the benefit of the doubt in the sense that I'm going to hold him to a higher standard. When I talk to him, he's actually playing around some of these corner case scenarios very often, so I think that's actually a straight up brain fart on his end. Just because when I listen to, you know, his insight, he is playing around these like 2 to 3 card corner case. If he feels like he's trying to press for a win, he does think about those things.
Right, so Professor Oak, without the option for healing, would have to, I believe, Defile just to proc the Divine Shield, and then I guess play Faceless just so you have another minion on board, and then trade. And Ender's outs here. I don't think there's any. And that means that Professor Oak will be able to just slam the second Void Lord.
Reporting for duty.
Ender is playing the second Spellbreaker in his list though, so if he draws into that, that could potentially give him the only convenient answer for this other Void Lord.
Now, I was about to say that there is like a problem that Professor Oak is kind of low on health, and we've seen some weird like knife chugger scenarios where they actually can still die just because they're so low on HP that the juggles might end it. So I was eyeing Call to Arms very carefully. Doesn't seem to be the case here. I have ran into a scenario once where I needed to Spellstone my own minion because I cleared the board too much, and then that opened me up to a removal. Like he had Spellbreaker Leroy because of that. So, you know, sometimes you get set up in these awkward scenarios because you want the buff to the Spellstone to offset the damage of the Hellfire. And I mean, Oak's thinking about it, man. He's like, what if he has like this ability to have a silence and then deal the damage and then get like a knife juggler hit for the win?
So the thing Professor Oak must be thinking about is that these 2 Divine Favors have been sitting in Ender's hand for quite a long time. He would be holding a second Spellbreaker if it were in hand. So aside from Divine Favor, I feel like those are the only cards that would have been just sitting around doing nothing. So I wouldn't mind preemptively Spellstoning here for Professor Oak. But if Ender were to draw into something like Call to Arms, that would make things a bit more difficult. Ender's just gonna give it up though.
Yeah, he's showing his cards essentially, and that's something that we usually do in physical card games, just to be like, ah, man, this is what I have. And that's going to wrap up Game 2. Professor Oak, the massive underdog, at least on the spreadsheet, heading into the series, is now up 2-0 thanks to a fortuitous misban from Ender, and also some pretty good play so far. I feel like even though the Barnes, of course, in the Big Priest game wasn't really much, with the Control Warlock, he was able to utilize that really well. Nice spot with the Cube and the Doom Guard as opposed to the Cabal Lackey play. And also gives an opportunity for his opponent to mess up as well with the Cabal Lackey Defile.
Sure, and so Ender, he's got a lot on his plate to still win with the Murloc Paladin, which I feel has been one of the strongest aggressive deck, if not like the only traditional aggro deck in the meta, in the sense that it goes wide on the board and relies on minions. These days, aggro means relying on the tall minions and effects like Spiteful Summoner, and then you have the anomaly of Secret Mage, which of course Mage has its own game plan when it comes to aggro.
I wouldn't call it aggro. I would just say it's more of a mid-range strategy these days. I guess unless you count anything hitting your face as aggro.
Sure.
The Spiteful Summoner, like those decks are just mainly about stacking the advantages on the board, securing it, and then of course some of them have like combo finishes, or some of them just have really good late game tools. Unless, I mean, it's hard to say, man. An aggro deck running Mind Control is a little bit of a stretch.
Sure. So the thing here is that there's only the Dude Paladin left for Professor Oak, and that's the deck that Ender actually meant to ban in the beginning. So it means that he's been scared of this deck if he was telling the truth, and we think he is. Yeah, especially since he has the Secret Mage in his lineup, he's really going to struggle to deal with all of this. And yeah, a lot of the players were debating between bringing the Dude Paladin versus the Murloc Paladin. We saw that most of them ended up favoring Murloc Paladin. However, I feel like the Dude Paladin could have an advantage in the mirror, just because it doesn't rely so much on synergy between stacking Murloc and Murloc. And when you're able to have the early board, it doesn't matter if your opponent has more synergy because they don't stick minions.
Yeah, it's a fair point. I do think that the edge tends to go to the person that has the early game one drop, you know,
Sure.
and is able to stick onto the board.
Slash go first and play one
Yeah,
drop.
so I wouldn't say that the person who goes first just wins, but a lot of times that's what ends up giving you the momentum. And then it kind of has this weird dance where like maybe a call to arms can swing if you're able to conserve your resources.
That is a godsend top deck for Ender there. Not only is it a one drop, any one of them would have been welcome, but it's the best one to contest the board that Professor Oak put down. If he wants to get rid of that Murloc, he'd have to just give up his Direwolf here to a possible Coin Rallying Blade.
How bad is the Coin Rallying Blade if you just put the Righteous Protector on turn 3 with a hero power, kind of loaded up for the Stegodon?
Probably not too bad, so I still think you gotta go for the Wolf and trade here. Of course, trading to prevent rock pool shenanigans and all of that.
Must move quickly.
And the funny thing is that Call to Arms is one of the few ways to possibly answer a board if you pull out Knife Juggler and it comes first. Otherwise, all of the damage outside of weapons comes from the minions, so there's no convenient ways to deal with a board outside of your own minions.
That is true.
That makes kind of the old days of playing Zoo Mirrors, if you're familiar with those mechanics, and just like you take value trades every single time. It's useful experience, so that is another incredible top deck.
Is Muster for Battle a good card?
I've been told. I've heard rumors and whisperings. And its spiritual successor, at least 1 in 4 times, is also a good card.
The light dims, but we fight.
Reporting for duty.
So now Ender's in a position to completely deny Professor Oak's board development and have the time to play his own stuff, drawing yet another great draw. I was gonna say there that just playing out a Naked War Leader doesn't feel too good, nor does Hydrologist plus Secret. But this way, he's able to have more minions to contest whatever Professor Oak plays, and at the same time develop his own Call to Arms. So if Professor Oak can draw call into something great like Knife Juggler early, and then the 2 other minions snipe one thing, that'd be insane.
Yeah, or maybe even Double Juggler.
Okay. Not quite there, but the fact that he pulled Righteous Protector means that if Ender wants to get rid of it, then he'd have to give up his Tidecaller, which is pretty big. Every minion counts in the mirror.
Yeah, even forcing Ender to consider going off the Call to Arms plan, because that is the advantage of going first, and that is why Professor Oak, who, by the way, is looking more stressed by the minute here, that is why it is so powerful to go first, because to force Ender off the coin immediately and use it to, and really delay his Call to Arms, giving Professor Oak this small window, even though Ender has drawn really well, giving him a small window for him to strike back.
And these Divine Shield minions are very, very annoying in the mirror, and oftentimes against also the Spiteful decks, like, or even Big Priest, we saw that you'd have to sink in so much damage just to get through them.
Let me
So Professor Oak here, I'm inclined to think he might just play uh like hero power trade and then the maul again. Is that a little too slow?
Hero power maul.
Oh, the Blessed Maul gives attack rather
Yes,
than
so
thought it gave Divine Shield.
I
So.
think I'd rather play the Argent Squire.
Hmm.
I mean, the value of holding the Argent Squire is you can fill out your curve a little bit better in the following turns, because then, assuming if you hero power, because the line gets cheaper, so then you have like multiple opportunities.
Yep. The argument for this is that he has not one but two cards that benefit off of having dudes in his hand, so that makes sense. These also just aren't minions that Ender is happy to be using Rallying Blade to get rid of. Although, being able to play Call to Arms on a relatively empty board is always a good feeling, and he could, of course, pull the Juggler of his own to clear off these minions very conveniently.
Yeah, what's the value of playing these double Murlocs as opposed to the Call to Arms? You're both stacking the board, but oh, this is interesting.
Yeah, I find this quite greedy. I feel like it's just so he's able to fit in more hero powers, but I don't know, I really like the Call to Arms there.
It feels like he's trying to squeeze out more value in this matchup because it hasn't become a race. It's just become a battle of resources. Wow, speaking of resources.
That is a crazy top deck.
Yeah, that is exactly what this deck tries to do.
Ender space.
It's not necessarily about just the Silverhand Recruit synergy. It's also the fact that it just has so many waves and waves of threats. And it has, you know, kind of like another setup of Call to Arms. Like, the real danger of Call to Arms is that Paladin has real follow-up to it. They summon Murlocs, which they can use War Leader or Megasword. And now the second layer of that with the Recruit Paladin is not just Call to Arms, but Stand Against Darkness.
And maybe Ender had this in mind when saving the Call to Arms, so that if you were to pull a Juggler, it would possibly clear more dudes, but the order on the Call to Arms pulls is a little bit unfortunate. And now, Stegodon has the potential to deal quite a lot of damage, if not, at the very least, clear off minions conveniently.
Yeah, now it's like an interesting thing because the Stegodon can get a Divine Shield adapt, which would make the rallying play like insane. So while you'd like to squeeze out a little bit more value with the Stegodon and the hero power, there is you know, hesitation to at least think about an additional adapt, which increases your chances of positive outcomes.
Yeah, and it's not like even if you don't get the Divine Shield, the Rallying Blade is still good because you can clear off either the Juggler or the Rock Pool. And if you get health buffs on these guys, they'll take some value trades. These are not the ones you want, but I mean, you're still trading off the board and taking good control of what's left. So
it's 21 damage. I mean, that's a lot. I'd be hard pressed to not at least pressure my opponent's life total significantly for a 2-turn lead.
You have to trade at least some of these, respecting Megastar and Tarim and things like that. And of course, just the Juggler on its own.
Yeah. Tarim is pretty problematic.
Oh, wow. Okay, so...
Yeah, I was going to at least kill the Juggler, but it's just so much better to set up that kind of lethal.
How much is Megastar and Wind Fury, honestly?
12, 15, that's lethal.
Yeah, it's lethal. I mean, is that lethal too?
That's plus 12.
Yeah.
That's
what the heck? Not trading there.
Whoa. Whoa.
Ender is looking just as dumbfounded as I feel right now. Professor Oak, I gotta say, he was in massive command of that game if he had just taken some trades there. Of course, the attack made it less appealing, but I mean, given that...
I can't even believe that he won!
Given that the Murloc Paladin struggles with refill a bit more than the Dude Paladin, I feel like as long as you keep the Murlocs off the board, you didn't have to trade all of them, maybe like one or two, just to prevent the only outs that Ender had. And granted, they were unlikely, but they were there.
It was specifically those two cards, and it had to hit one of two adapts, which is Wind Fury and +3 attack, so that's a 20%, I guess.
But I still feel like he had the 100% if he had taken some trades, so maybe Professor Oak, a little bit of fatigue getting to him. It's also that Tarim was a bit threatening as well.
What was the last card that he was holding in his hand for Professor Oak?
Can't quite remember. But
Huh.
yeah, Ender finally getting a win on the board.
Interesting. Yeah, I want to say it was like a jailer or something, but I'm not sure. But man, that definitely could change the entire outcome of the series. And while again, it's unlikely that he has like a Murloc War Leader and a Megasaur and land the adapt. You gave him that possibility.
Exactly.
That's exactly what we mean when in our community we say giving percentage points. You gave them a chance to win as opposed to potentially playing for the 100%. Now, I don't know if he would be 100% to win because there might be some crazy thing that we're not thinking about if he call to arms and War Leader trades type scenarios. I'm not sure, but you have to kind of wonder what if. And if he loses because of that, that might be a big deal.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's what's going through Professor Oak's head right now. But when you trip up like that, it's really important not to get too lost in your own head because that can definitely affect your play in later games. So Professor Oak still up 2-1, of course, so he has, to be in a comfortable position. But again, Ender being the guy that has not lost his energy all throughout the day might be a bit of a psychological advantage at the very least.
Well, we are 3 games in, and we might have 1 or 2 more, so we'll find out what ends up happening. So don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a sec.
The Sydney HCT stop is proudly supported by McDonald's Australia.
Welcome back, everyone, to Hearthstone Championship Tour Sydney Tour Stop. We are currently in the middle of series of our last series of the day. It's quite the marathon. You hanging in there, Jiao?
Yeah, just barely. It's been a long day for the players, especially. And I remember some people backstage in the waiting area mentioning that the schedule can be a bit of a throw-off depending on what time you're scheduled to play on stream, because it means that you could have these long waiting periods into suddenly a bunch of games in a row, whereas some other players could have like one game, then a healthy rest period, and then another game, and keep a steady pace going. So if you're a player that likes the momentum, sometimes the offline format and on-stream format can be a little bit more difficult to adapt to.
I know there's a lot of factors to consider, it's not necessarily just being on camera. It's the idea that that a lot of people are watching, and it kind of changes some people's perception on what's happening around them. They call it oh man, I forgot the actual term. I'm not really familiar with a lot of like stage stuff. I never really did like Broadway stuff, like song, dance, theater. But there's like a term there, like if the lights are on, you start getting like dizzy and you can't think straight type thing. Some players aren't used to that. You know, they aren't used to the lights, the cameras. There's so many people here. It can be overwhelming at times, especially if it's their first event ever, which is a handful of players' experience so far.
Right, and just to remind you guys, Ender mentioned that he wanted to ban this dude paladin away, which means he was scared of it. At least its matchup versus most of the decks in his lineup, but actually misclicked the ban and ended up letting it through, although he was able to get the first win against it. And now he has one of the key cards for dealing with this deck in his Spiteful Priest hand, which is Dustbreaker. Pretty much an essential keep in this matchup. He does not quite have the dragon to activate it yet. And of course, the Dude Paladin can be very resilient with its Divine Shield minions and many effects to give Divine Shields to its minions. So Dustbreaker alone is often not enough to get there for the Spiteful Priest. Like, it's more important, I'd say, to have a Cleric on one to be able to deal with the first few Dude slash small Divine Shield minions, but Ender was not able to draw into it. You kept saying that clerics kept appearing on turn 1 for Spiteful Priest, huh? So
I did.
When it matters most,
it
not
finally
showing up.
happened. It's unbelievable, and it's I wish it would happen more when I played against this deck. But you know, in the deck's defense, I also draw a cleric every time I play it. So it's not necessarily just my opponents. You know, I'm not complaining about that. It's just something
Rigged.
weird in the water. That's the weird Darkshire can be absolutely massive.
Yeah, with
It can stop that Dustbreaker right its tracks.
And Ender hasn't even drawn into a dragon to activate it yet, so this could be getting out of hand really, really quickly.
Right. This was a thing about Professor Oak's position, is because he won the unfavorable match of the Big Priest versus Murloc Paladin, and it took so many games for Ender to get a win with one of his best decks in the lineup. Now Professor Oak is favored all the way through, as the Recruit Paladin has some very explosive matchups and sometimes just have unanswerable boards.
Yeah, and this seems like one of the boards that is really inconvenient for Ender to deal with. He was forced to play out the Acolyte just as a 2/4, having nothing else to do to contest the board. And Call to Arms just going to make his life even more difficult, even if he draws into a dragon. There's just still going to be 3 minions sticking, and he's going to be giving Professor Oak the Death Rattle from the Jailer. Still no dragon, though, so... Man, I don't know what he can do here. Coin Song Stealer?
Yeah, at this point, it's starting to look like another blowout here for Professor Oak. Ender trying to reduce the amount of damage onto the board,
Oh
but
my
that is
gosh.
not going to stop Professor Oak's rampage. How much damage is this? 4, 6, 8, 10, plus 3 is 13.
Plus another 3 from the buffs, and well, the attack of the weapon and the buffs, so
That was 16.
16. And that means that even if Dustbreaker were to be drawn, I mean, a dragon to activate Dustbreaker were to be drawn the next turn, Professor Oak still has lethal with the weapon. Not even counting the minions that still stick, so
Yeah.
this is over.
This was a non-game. This didn't really happen. This game didn't actually really happen. But you know, you have to kind of go back to the fact that Ender said he wanted to ban the Paladin.
Yeah.
And this matchup shouldn't even be happening on camera.
Yeah.
So this is something long and hard to think about for Ender as we go into day number 2. But that's going to be the conclusion of it. Ender concedes, thumbs up, and we have our top 4 in the winner's bracket as Professor Oak crushes the Cthulhu Druid lineup. No, he didn't even play it this series. I want to see Cthulhu played once. I offered a bet to other people, you know, as a friendly wager, nothing on the line, but it's like, do you think Cthulhu Druid's good, or do you think Cthulhu will actually be played for its battle cry this entire tournament? And no one wanted to take me up on that.
Yeah.
They think it's not going to get played.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And you can't really blame us because that deck wins more often than not by playing Spiteful Summoner, and then you just get there that way.
Well, I mean, you see Cthulhu off of Spiteful Summoner more often than you
True.
actually see it being played as just a card in its battle cry. But and look at the good sportsmanship and respect. You know, they're talking about their games, and if I know Ender really well, which I don't because I just met him today, or yesterday rather, but he's probably talking about all the things that he think he could have done better outside the ban, of course.
Yeah, you don't need to know this guy very well to know that